Hello and welcome to another video tutorial from screencastworld.com. In this series of tutorials I'll show you how to create a MySQL database and database user to support the installation of Magento Commerce. It's important to think about security when installing any application, however this is especially true when installing something that's going to be made public on the internet. If you're new to Magento and you're installing it on a local development system to give it a test drive, then security isn't going to be much of a concern for you. However, if you're going to be installing Magento for the purposes of developing a production environment, or you're installing Magento on your live website, then security is a top priority. Magento stores almost everything in the database, including the Magento configuration, product information, and customer contact and payment details, so you need to ensure the database isn't compromised in any way. For this introductory screencast, I want to focus on providing you with a list of golden rules and things to keep in mind when creating your database and database user to ensure you maximize security. For security purposes, the user we create must have access to the Magento database and only that Magento database. If you have a single database user that has access to both your forums and blog, for example, if that username and password is compromised, then those functions of your website are also compromised. By assigning one user to one database, we can limit the exposure should those credentials fall into the wrong hands. You should also never give the Magento database user more privileges than they actually need. For example, giving the user global permission is not recommended. Also, giving the user administrative rights is also not recommended. Now I'll show you what privileges you'll need to assign as we go through creating a database and user credentials. Now, as I previously stated, Magento stores almost everything within the database, so if it's compromised, so is all your e-commerce and customer data. Thankfully, Magento stores sensitive data, such as customer payment details, in an encrypted format within the database. However, you must take every precaution to ensure that only authorized users have access to the database itself. Now remember that customer data and customer privacy is your responsibility and is defined in the Data Protection Act of 1998. Essentially meaning that if your site, regardless of whether it's an e-commerce site or not, you need to keep the customer details private and secure. Finally, we need to limit where the database user can log in from. If your MySQL database server and web server run on the same system, which is going to be the case for the majority of situations, then only allowing database users to log on from that web server means that hackers first need to compromise your web server before they can access the database. This is a simple and highly effective security measure. If your web server and database server are different physical systems, then you can limit the access to a single IP address. There are lots of ways of hardening your database, and you'll need to employ a variety of techniques to ensure you maximize your security efforts. The techniques you use largely depend on your web server solution, i.e. whether you're using a shared hosting server, a dedicated server, or a cloud computing environment, for example. Security is such a large topic, it's impossible to cover it in one go, so I'll aim to cover security and hardening tips and techniques and methods throughout screencasts and articles on screencastworld.com. So I highly recommend registering on screencastworld.com as it allows you to be kept up to date with all the latest updates. So I'm going to discuss the easiest security method to implement, which is security through obfuscation. So before we create the database and user, we must first decide what we're going to call the database and think of a suitable username and password for our user. If you follow the Magento installation guide or Magento books, you'll most likely have created a database called Magento. While short, descriptive and meaningful for the administrator, it's also easily guessed by any hackers trying to get at your customer data. At the time of writing, Magento's website says they have over 30,000 installations of Magento. Ask yourself how many of them have the database called Magento. I don't know the real answer, but it's going to be a fairly large percentage. From a hacker's perspective, this is the first thing they'll try, along with a few other obvious naming conventions. Hackers will always try to hit the easy targets first, so make sure you're not one of them. Try to reduce the threat by not calling your database Magento or Mag, for example. Instead, employ a technique called security through obfuscation. This method won't provide total security, but it will deter any casual sniffing and slow down any possible attacks against your database. The definition of the word obfuscate is to make obscure or unclear by adding extraneous information. So my tip and recommendation is that you choose 5 or 6 random characters and numbers to put either as a prefix, suffix, or both to your database name. So the first example we have here is adding a suffix to our database name. So we have Magento _AI48L1. The second example is adding a prefix to your database name, such as N0S7R22_Magento. And finally we have an example of prefix and postfixing of P23_mag_9G. It's best to avoid ultra-long database names or names with special characters in. However, it still needs to be meaningful to your database administrators. Now, if you're on a shared hosting server, then you'll most likely find that your database is automatically prefixed with your cPanel username. Whilst the form of obfuscation itself, your username is typically the first 7 characters of your domain plus a single digit, so it's easily guessed. You'll also find that your web hosting provider limits the number of characters for your database, so you will be limited in what you can choose. You can still employ the technique though by using something like your username _mag73h, for example. If you're on a dedicated server, then you'll have a full choice of possible database names that MySQL will allow. Refer to the MySQL database documentation to see what is and is not allowed in naming conventions for database names. You need to think along similar lines when you select the database username that Magento will be using to connect to your database. Usernames such as Magento, Magento ADM, Magento Admin for example, and all their similar hyphenated and underscore counterparts are all too easily guessed, so use the obfuscation technique to make it harder for any would-be attackers. Now when it comes to choosing passwords, the longer the better, as you won't be logging into the database yourself using these credentials. A minimum password of 16 characters, numbers, and special characters is advised. If you're using the cPanel Database Wizard, Database Manager, or PHP/MyAdmin, they all provide integrated password generators. If you need a different service, use one of the free online password generators. I recommend onlinepasswordgenerator.com. Now that I've armed you with some hints and tips for choosing secure database names, database users, and passwords, it's time to actually create our database so we can crack on with the process of installing Magento. And there are many ways to create the database in User, and I will show you 4 of the more popular methods. These are using the cPanel MySQL Database Wizard, using the MySQL Databases facility also found within cPanel, PHP/MyAdmin, and the command line. There are of course other methods, but these are the 4 most popular, so I'll show you each method in a separate screencast. Now methods 1 to 4 can be used on your live web server, although method 4 assumes you'll have SSH connectivity to your web server. Methods 3 and 4 can also be used on your local development server. Well, that brings us to the end of this introductory screencast of how to create a database in User to support our Magento installation. If you'd like to watch the rest of the screencasts in this series, or any other series, please go to screencastworld.com or look at the Screencast World video channel. Feedback is important to me, so if you like this screencast, please take a moment to comment and rate it. It just leaves me to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon for another screencast by screencastworld.com.